President Trump, as he said, will try to cut a deal despite the negatives that could happen here in Ukraine. We've always, done the right thing. It just takes, as Winston Churchill says, doing everything else before we get to do the right thing. It were the people on the street that were saying thank you to us. I do believe in Ukraine a victory, but it's going to be up to the Ukrainians to define that victory and ensure that the Americans support that definition.
Congressman, happy to have you here in Kyiv with us. And first of all, let me thank you for your support to Ukraine. You are a frequent traveler here. You've been here just a month ago.
That's right. Early August, I came here with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, otherwise known as CSIS, in which we really had an excellent on-the-ground, boots-on-the-ground trip where we came in through Moldova, went to Odessa, stayed the night there, and then made our way up to Kyiv. And we're able to stay on the ground for about 5 nights, which is unusual for most congressional trips. When you do a trip through the U.S. Congress, the State Department is not allowing us to stay overnight here, which I think is to our detriment, because in our trip, in which we were able to get on the ground, we weren't just able to have meetings with high-level military leaders and government leaders. We actually talked to the civilians. We actually talked to the workers. We actually talked to the military members. We actually talked to the victims of the bombings and actually developed a great, not just understanding, but an empathy for what's going on here on the ground. For example, it wasn't just the leaders in the government who are thanking us for the F-16s. It were the people on the street that were saying thank you to us. And to me, that demonstrates how important it is not just strategically to have the type of appropriate weaponry, but the morale booster that it does for people on the ground as well, something that I think is needed.
I think you feel Ukraine probably even better than many US diplomats. I hope that you will be somehow involved in policy making also in the news cycle.
Well, look, I think obviously as a U.S. representative, someone who wears his pen proudly as a representative of the 19th Congressional District in California, what I've heard from my constituents is that it is important that the United States of America maintain its support for this fledgling democracy fighting against an autocracy that invaded unjustly in regards to what happened back in February of 2022. So please know that that is my sentiment, not just because I'm here, but because of what I do in my district back in California.
Not every constituency in the United States is, well, the same way pro-Ukrainian.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And we see that this is changing somehow, not always in a favorable for us way. What is going on? Why are we losing to some degree support of ordinary American people?
Look, I think it's not just about Ukraine. It's sort of about American society, and that obviously, as you saw early on when the unjust and unprovoked invasion occurred, there was an overwhelming amount of bipartisan support. But it's not just about support. What I've realized in my time as a representative, it's about the sustained support. We're not going through what you're going through, but the fact is that we are the #1 supporter, and therefore people feel that it could be taken away from any sort of remedies that could occur in their life. That being said, it's incumbent upon us as representatives to ensure that people fully understand why we need to continue to support Ukraine, not just now when they're pushed back on this invasion, but basically having a full comprehension that if it doesn't happen now, it will be a lot worse and a lot more support when it comes to not just here in Ukraine, but maybe Poland, maybe in Eastern Europe.
You mean they can be attacked by Russia?
And look, I think that's what people understand. You really don't know what Vladimir Putin intends, but I think it's you can make the appropriate supposition based on the fact of what he did, what he's thinking here in Ukraine, and where he will continue to go. And then it will be incumbent upon the United States to not just provide financial support, but to provide military support and provide our troops on the ground. I think a good indication of how things develop is look at Speaker Mike Johnson. Speaker Mike Johnson, prior to him being Speaker, was a Congress member from Northwest Louisiana. Clearly a very conservative district, clearly a district that was pro-President Trump, a district that was leaning towards stopping support for Ukraine. He became elevated to Speaker, as you know, and he had to have a learning experience. He had to have people come in and talk to him and convince him, in addition to the fact that his son is now in one of the military academies in the United States. So he not only looked at it and learned intelligently about the issue, but he also took it personally about what could happen if we don't stop Vladimir Putin now, what could happen in the future, not just to Ukraine, not just to the United States, but to his own family.
That is exactly what my next questions are about developments in the US politics after elections. Let me be frank. Now we in Ukraine feel ourselves I would say, on the brink of uncertainty, because we don't know what would be the US policy. And let's speculate a bit. So if Kamala Harris wins, we do not know, but if she wins, what would happen with support of Ukraine?
Well, look, I think you do know, and I think we know exactly what the U.S. policy is now, thanks to the leadership of President Biden, thanks to the leadership of this administration. Continue to support our ally and our fellow democracy, Ukraine. And that will continue to be the policy of the Biden administration. Going forward, you obviously have two presidential candidates, one who made it clear where she is when it comes to support for Ukraine, one who clearly hesitated and couldn't answer the question just this week when it came to whether or not Ukraine should win. So I think we do know what could happen if there is a President Harris and if there is a President Trump. President Trump, as he said, will try to cut a deal despite the negatives that could happen here in Ukraine. President Harris has made clear she will continue to support Ukraine in its efforts to succeed.
Let me be frank. In Ukraine, when someone says that US policy towards Ukraine would be continued, it sounds not that positive. Because in Ukraine, we see that the current United States policy is rather hesitant, not that active, so continuation is definitely not the best choice.
Look, I think obviously when it comes to the United States policy for support for Ukraine, it's more than just one person. It's the United States Congress. And what we've seen is that the Congress has consistently and overwhelmingly on a bipartisan basis agreed on supporting our ally here in Ukraine. And I believe that when we get the opportunity to vote on that type of supplemental support, it will pass. Now, will the politics be difficult? Absolutely. Not just because of the politics, but because obviously it's like I said, it's going on, making sure there's not just support, but sustained support. And that's why I believe it's incumbent on me as a U.S. representative to continue to talk about the benefits and why it's important that we continue to support Ukraine in its efforts to push back on Vladimir Putin. I also feel that basically that's exactly why I'm here for a second time in less than 2 months, because it helps me to obviously develop the comprehension as to what Ukrainians are going through, why it's important for them to succeed, and why it's important for the United States to continue its sustained support for Ukraine.
Ukraine is very vocal in asking to lift restrictions on deep airstrikes on Russia and so on. So can it change?
Look, I think we've seen it change. So clearly the answer is yes. Let's make that clear. Now, what is the process of getting to yes? It can be a little slow. I'll be the first to admit it. Early on, I said we should provide Ukraine with the armaments it needs. They're the ones on the ground. They're the one who understands what capabilities it takes to punch back when it comes to defending themselves. So I think it's obviously there are those who are tentative and like to work through each and every equation in order to get to yes. But I think despite some resistance early on, you see our policy come around and get to yes. And I believe it will continue to get to yes and be at yes when it comes to supporting Ukraine with the appropriate armaments.
You talk to people who are expected to be in Kamala Harris administration. starting from January next year. How do you see, are they ready to make brave steps?
I would look at Kamala Harris being in the Biden administration right now and how the Biden administration is acting. Well, I agree with you, as I said. Early on, it takes some process, some learning process, but they are going through the appropriate iterations to get to yes. And I believe that's exactly where Kamala Harris will be. Look, I think a perfect example are the permissions. I think, the two things that I heard last month that I think are still relevant today are making sure that they have permissions to use Western donated equipment and technology to go beyond the border and ensure that Russia isn't allowed sanctuary on its land for its weapons and carrying out these attacks, which clearly it was doing. And so I think you're starting to see, especially you look at the reaction of the incursion by Ukraine into Russia recently and how we responded. And I think you're going to see similar sort of either non-reactions or positive reactions when it comes to these types of permissions going forward.
You deal with foreign affairs, and you definitely understand how important it is that to have the United States as a dominating world power. But do American people also understand that?
I believe they do, absolutely. Obviously, we have our politics, we have our divisions, and we have our dysfunction because of those divisions. But the fact is, when it came down to providing the supplemental to Ukraine, to our democratic partners throughout the world, you saw members of Congress step up and vote yes, not just for Ukraine, but for Taiwan and other democratic partners throughout the world. So I think that's an example of, even despite the chaos of the 118th Congress, despite it being an election year, you still had the United States Congress, 435 of us, do the right thing when it comes to basically supporting Ukraine. And that's the type of what I think, efforts it will get to, but efforts it will take to get to yes going forward.
But I mean, when it comes to ordinary Americans,
this is obviously just like the United States Congress. The United States has a lot going on. We understand that domestically and internationally. But I do believe that we're a country that's capable of, as we say, walking and chewing gum at the same time. We can do both. It obviously takes a political will, but I believe if you look at the history of the United States, and despite the difficulties that we've been through, we've always, done the right thing. It just takes, as Winston Churchill says, doing everything else before we get to do the right thing. I think going forward, it's incumbent upon our nation's leaders in the United States to continue to remind people why it is important that we have sustained support for Ukraine. That's exactly why I'm here this week, a very quick weekend. It's exactly why I came over a month ago, because it's important that I develop that empathy upon which I can use to discuss the strategy going forward in supporting Ukraine.
Do you believe in Ukrainian victory?
I do believe in Ukraine a victory, but it's going to be up to the Ukrainians to define that victory and ensure that the Americans support that definition.
Once we win, how can it be guaranteed that Russia do not attack again?
Look, I think obviously there are certain steps that we're going to, and Ukraine is going to learn from as well. But this is something that we have to think very deeply when it comes to Vladimir Putin and what his intentions are. And it's going to probably rely not just on Americans, not just on Ukrainians, but the Russians as well. What will they do in regards to this type of leader who basically puts them on a brink of going bankrupt and basically makes them vulnerable when it comes to expending all of these resources on this unjust and unprovoked attack of Ukraine. So hopefully, basically, they can obviously step up and do the right thing as well.
I do believe that, to be frank, that with Putin this war would not be stopped. And you're quite right, it's up to Russians to get rid of Putin. But at the same time, let's not hide the fact that it's not only him. Ukrainians are hated by quite an enormous number of Russians. And if we do not have some mechanisms this war would erupt again. We've seen that plenty times in our history.
Yeah, and I think beyond that too, it's watching the countries who were supporting Russia at this time. China, Iran, North Korea. What type of steps can we do to prevent that type of support going forward?
Let me clarify what I expected to hear from you. When I asked about mechanism, I expected to hear the word NATO,
sure,
Ukrainian NATO membership, but you did not mention it.
Look, I think obviously, as Anthony Blinken said this week, NATO is on a path, an irreversible path to NATO membership. So I believe that NATO can continue to go down that path and continue to ultimately obtain membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organizations, but that's going to take some time. I think first things first, and obviously defeating Russia and succeeding in this war.
Some people say that the reason why many American politicians are hesitant to be exact about NATO membership and other steps is a Russian nuclear threat. Is it really there?
I mean, look, it's something you have to consider, you must consider, but I also think you have to look at where it has gone when it comes to any sort of escalation over these last couple years. So taking that into account, in addition to the fact that they have nuclear weapons and can use nuclear weapons, is all part of the calculus going forward.
But do you believe that they will do that? I don't.
Look, I can't answer that. I don't know that. But the fact is that it's something you must consider in regards to the issues that are and the challenges that we face here in Ukraine.
And the very last question, now in Ukraine we hear some speculations, thoughts about PDA part of supplemental, which is $6.something billion. Would it be cancelled if you did not use it by 30th of September? Yeah. Or there are ways to prolong it?
Yeah, look, obviously I think in this year's PDA, Presidential Drawdown Authority, was $7.4 billion. Normally, as it's written into law, it's $100 million. If the remainder of that PDA is not used, it goes down to $100 million. So first and foremost, hopefully this administration uses what has been allocated to them.
It's not possible by the end of September.
Look, hopefully they find ways to make it happen. And if not, then we'll look at ways of when it comes to the continuing resolution that we have to do in Congress in the next couple of weeks, including that in there. And that will be my efforts to have every intention to make sure that occurs.
So we can expect that it will be prolonged if it is not used fully.
Look, that's going to be my intention, is to make sure that we give the administration the ability to use what we allocated it to use.
Thank you. And again, thank you for supporting Ukraine in these hard times. We really appreciate efforts of our friends in the United States Congress.
Thank you. Appreciate it.